Right. Publisher pairs.
We're not in a publishing period.
All right, where are you going? I may be retired, but I still have that technique, which seems to work reasonably well. All right, so we are here for the last session for the symposium. We've had, of course, crews coming in and out earlier. For those of you who haven't been here earlier, I will give you a very brief thumbnail summary of what we've done so far. In the 9 o'clock hour, we talked about what the definition of negotiation is or isn't, and in a very brief discussion, we came to the conclusion we have no idea. There isn't a clear definition of what negotiation is or isn't, and we're going to have to move on with that. And we spent a lot of time in both the 9 o'clock hour and the 10 o'clock hour talking about what the heck the value of negotiation theory is. And we similarly came up with no good answer to that question. And we talked a lot about what problems there are with negotiation theory and how you would even know what it would be and why we're even doing this. And at the conclusion of the last hour, we were in complete confusion, and all we, I think, could agree on was that it just didn't work very well. There were a lot of problems, particularly with this integrative, distributive notion of a cooperative or adversarial approach, or a variety of ways of thinking about negotiation. So that's kind of the context or the setting for this. And this, in our last hour, all will be made clear. We will solve all the problems of negotiation theory. So just want to set your expectations appropriately low. So I'm going to start off by asking Noam a question, and then I know Chris wants to jump in, and I've been encouraged to engage the audience. I know there have been some people who really want to participate, and it's kind of hard when you have a lot of articulate people who have a lot of things to say, but I want to encourage everybody to feel free if you want to jump in to raise your hand, and I'll try and elbow these people to be quiet for a while. So, but first let me turn to Noam with a question about whether negotiation has changed, or the negotiators have changed over the past 40 or 50 years since our current theoretical frameworks were developed. Has negotiation changed, not just negotiators? Can we expect them to change or continue to change in the future? Assuming that the answers to any of these questions is yes, how should negotiation theory be changed? What parts are still relevant and what parts need to be discarded or fundamentally revised? So, easy question. Softball to you know.
Yes. And as John has introduced it, now is when we're going to solve everything. Not going to do any of that. In the sense that I think that these questions make everything we've talked about so far much more complex. We've had kind of the luxury of talking about negotiation as if it were a thing, and we can talk about how best to conceptualize it, what theories fit best into it, or describe or prescribe best for it. And I'm going to suggest that negotiation is no such thing. Negotiation is a moving target, and negotiation. Let's go back to the Tower of Babel. Okay, the Tower of Babel is not, are we only converged or a mosaic? It's not, are there many different languages? The Tower of Babel is a story of change. The full is, I don't know if this time for a full biblical story, but the stragglers from Noah's flood. My family's in Jacksonville right now, so I have this on my mind. The stragglers straggled out of this devastation, this cataclysmic upheaval and change, found themselves to have survived, tried to adapt in order to survive better, started to build a huge tower that will keep them all together, and then had that blown to hell, and found themselves speaking different languages. So if there's what is the Tower of Babel about? It's about the change happens, and then it happens again. And I think that we have witnessed in our generation, whatever a generation is, generations are happening faster nowadays. But over the course of the past 30 to 50 years, everything has changed very, very significantly. The way we do everything, I'm 43 years old, so I think I kind of fit into that. the way I do everything now is completely different than the way I used to, and it's not just because now I have a driver's license and before I didn't. It's because the way many of us used to do things has now changed, and it's not just the way we do things. It's all the underlying elements of how we do things. It's where we get our information from, how we communicate with one another, how we act in our professional lives. Everything has changed. A large part of that, or a large part of my work with regards to that, has been on changes brought on by technology and incorporation of technology into our lives and our professional lives. But I think that the technological changes, insofar as we've been talking about them, we've only been talking about them on a utilitarian, kind of very limited way. A lot of my work has been on this, like how do we negotiate differently via email, an article I wrote with Andrew and some others, than in a face-to-face. How do we negotiate differently via video conferencing than we do? But I'm concerned that even this work kind of hides the bigger question, because this work kind of emphasizes negotiation stays the same and we're still the same people, we're still the same negotiators. There are just small tweaks that happen when you are typing an email or speaking into Skype than when we're sitting in a room. But I think that much more fundamental changes have happened in who we are and how people function, and to imagine that negotiation, as unique from everything else in the world, negotiation has stayed the same thing. And the negotiators that were written about 40 years ago are the same negotiators that we are dealing with today. I think, said Noam somewhat unprovocatively, I think that might not be entirely accurate. I'm going to leave it at that.
So Chris is going to very briefly tell a story
All right.
to illustrate this.
And I'm going to see if I can get the students into the act. I'm going to stand up if you don't mind.
Permission granted.
Thank you. Okay, I would like you to endure a hypothetical, okay? I believe that's happened to you before. This is aimed particularly at the students. I would like you to think about one particular domain of work, not your own, and put yourself back about 11 years. It's 2005. You are in Iraq. You are a junior Army officer, a captain in charge of a company, all right? And there are other companies around you, staffed similarly by a captain at the head and with officers still junior to that, second lieutenants under those people. And you start to see what might be called by a scientist a natural experiment, because these second lieutenants are being sent out day after day on patrols with scared young recruits. And there's a pattern you begin to see. There's a range of what happens. But at the extremes, some of these second lieutenants come back, and after 3 hours, there are bodies all over the street. And at the other end of the range, some of these second lieutenants are going out, and 3 hours later, there are invitations to dinner and the beginnings of an agreement with the local mullah and the local chieftain to bring peace and maintain it to that particular neighborhood. What do you do? You're a company commander. You're pretty junior in the Army scheme of things. What do you do with this? Anybody got a suggestion?
I'd be trying to maximize the patrols by the people that are reaching the agreements and trying to get the people that are putting bodies in the street.
Everybody's working 16 hours a day. You've got to use everybody. But if you had more resources, absolutely right.
Can we participate?
Sure. You're a lifelong.
Can I go see what they're doing?
You've got your own job to do.
No, but I could
You're
ask
busy all
them.
the
I
time.
never
What?
see them.
Sorry.
I never see them to ask, what are you up to? That it's so successful?
Good question. I don't know the answer to it. Someone else.
See, Chris he's not a law professor, but he's playing one.
So I need somebody to play a law student. Give me your hypothetical answer. What do you do? Stuck. All right.
People were giving actually good answers, but he's being.
All right.
He's saying,
Okay, I'm
don't
going
fight
to say
the
this is not a
hypothetical.
hypothetical. All right. This actually happened. And what the officer in question did is he started sending messages up the chain of command. And the messages basically said, send us more of that second group and fewer of the first. And it being the Army, an answer came back. And the Army gave a very Army-like answer.
We don't know.
What do you think it was? Sorry?
Figure it out.
Actually, yes. But it came in a particularly order form, okay? And the order was, you are hereby ordered that your next assignment will be as the most junior possible professor at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Go there and make us some. That was the juncture at which I met Leonard Lira, who is the officer in question. And by the way, there was a second codicil to that order. You are hereby promoted major. Major Leonard Lira arrives at West Point as the most junior possible teacher in the Army's premier educational institution. And he now has a problem. He has to teach negotiation to cadets who have joined the Army, a volunteer Army, and they've joined the Army to make war. And remember, it's 2005, it's not that long after 2001. The failures of Iraq have not yet become massive public knowledge, all right? These people have joined up in order to go fight somebody. What do? Well, the first thing you do is you do not call the course that you are about to create negotiation, all right? Because you want some people to sign up. You call it winning the peace. It gets people to sign up. Now how are you going to convince them that people in uniform ought to adopt a new theory, which is you're not sent out there to kill people? This is a big theory change for an army. And he scratches his head a bit and he says, I need an example, I need a success story. I need somebody in uniform who has done this and is conspicuously good at it and everybody approves of the result. There is somebody like that, and it happens to be in the neighborhood. He puts in a call trying to find the chief hostage negotiator of the New York Police Department. The New York Police Department had the first and still the best team of hostage negotiators of any police department in the world. They have a model for many others now. They've existed for 40 years. Andrea and I have worked with that team for more than 10 years. And it so happened that at the moment that the phone call came in to the desk of a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York, who was a point of contact then and now for everything negotiation related in the city of New York and anywhere around, I happened to be working with her and I was sitting across the desk from her. So,
You're going to wrap this up soon, right?
oh, yeah, this is just the beginning. Okay, we'll move on. The upshot was, I ended up knowing this Army officer. He ended up working with the chief hostage negotiator, and things move on, all right? They teach the course, he goes back to Iraq. Second appointment. This time he's operations officer under the commanding general in Tikrit. What that means is, in plain language, the Army has adapted to the idea of his having succeeded by teaching this course by giving him a higher level assignment. This is cultural change, okay? Next thing that happens is he gets assigned to not very far from here, the Army's, what do they call it? It's the Mid-Career Retraining Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I can't think of the title at the moment. All right. But
You're going to wrap this up
is
soon,
an Army
right?
officer who is moving up, okay? By now, he has had two more jobs. One is Director of Operations for all NATO military forces in Kabul last year, in which he told Andrea and me in the middle of that, he had now learned to say thank you in 17 languages because he was in charge of military units from 24 different countries. Do you think that's not a negotiation job? And in a further example of the Army adapting, they then promote him colonel. And when they create the Army University this year out of 60 different higher education programs they were running. They created a center on teaching and training excellence, and they put him in charge of it. I believe there is real change in the people and in the institutions that deal with negotiation. And I think the Army is a hard case. In other words, it's a resistant case. And I think this story establishes that it does happen.
So in some ways, the world is changing, institutions may change, life in terms of technology. I think about, all the people who have their laptops open, who are checking their smartphones, and this is just part of their life. It's not just a particular thing in terms of negotiation behavior. So the theme of this session is how can we how can we advance negotiation theory in some way, recognizing changes and recognizing the reality of what does and doesn't happen. In the last session, David Matz was talking about how we don't maybe know what really happens in negotiations. So how can we move forward? Did you want to comment? I know Sandra was saying that there was someone.
I will comment.
Go ahead.
I've been an attorney for over 20 years, and I still use every day what I learned in negotiation class. Depending upon the importance of the negotiation, that depends upon how much prep I put in advance. Obviously, we all are busy. But I will still, on big negotiations, plan it out, conduct the negotiation according to the plan, and then analyze it afterwards and during the course, how it's proceeding, and then kind of do a post-evaluation breakdown, just like I was taught over 20 years ago in law school. I'm kind of glad that people on the other side don't take negotiation classes, because oftentimes it's much easier to get to the result because they don't necessarily, they're kind of just winging it as they go along. So I appreciate all the work you all are doing, as well as the fact law school is putting this on. If I had to say I get questions from people thinking about going to law school all the time, should I do this? And I'm always like, well, all of the expensive law school and the headache was worth one thing that my negotiation professor told me all those years ago. And that was fundamentally every negotiation is about respect, and the people on the other side have to feel that you respect them. And the example he used, I still remember this, was it may be that you respect them. The only thing you can find on the other side of respect is that they have matching socks, or that their socks do not match, and how creative is that? So, going forward, the problems that I've had in negotiations have had to do with how you deal with legal ethics in the context of negotiation, and whether maybe you're sacrificing one client for another, or if you're dealing with someone who's profoundly mentally ill on the other side, where that boundary is on the negotiation. And then also dealing with negotiations in an organization when you're representing that organization, and how sometimes people in that organization during the course, even though you've planned it out beautifully, might sabotage the negotiation because they maybe think they have better skills and techniques, and where you go with that.
So we have two examples of people talking about experiences. Part of what theory is about is trying to make some generalizations, and how we can make useful generalizations. Part of what we're here for is thinking about practitioners and students, as well as David was talking about just getting a more realistic understanding of what actually happens. Adrian, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to take the opposite stance here, which is, if we take the core of negotiation theory, what I hear you saying is what you learned 20 years ago in this class, you still apply today. I want to start from this. I think the core of negotiation techniques is still the same. So the world has changed, but the way we interact as human beings, even if now it's through cell phones and text messages, the core of it, which is to prepare a negotiation, to have an alternative, to understand different elements and to play with them, and like a chess player, and like the analogy you used earlier, has that changed over 50 years? Has that really changed in 50 years? I'm sorry?
Or forever.
or forever. And you have examples of negotiations in the Code of Hammurabi, I think, in the Bible. And these examples, of course, the world has changed tremendously, but the positioning of the parties, the interest behind the position, the relations, the procedural justice that you mentioned, which is the people need to feel empowered and welcome in a negotiation because that unlocks some things. Has it really changed? I had my first class in negotiation in 2000. I started teaching in 2007. Of course, technology has changed a lot. Of course, the world, and we're not negotiating the same thing. We're negotiating now image on the internet and stuff that did not exist at that time. But if we're talking about a theory, has that changed? And my answer would be no. But if I had to pick one. Now what do we do? Because I like some of the discussion that we're having. I think one question that is on my mind is the positioning of the negotiation field compared to other fields around it. To the field of law in general, we're in law school, but also to the field of management, to the field of, sales management, for example. In marketing, you have something called sales management, which is basically how to get a negotiator to do what you expect them to do. How many papers from sales management are quoted or used in teaching negotiation? 0 probably. Some of our answers are there. Why do we keep the discussion among ourselves? One question that I'm working on is how do we as an organization, so it could be a law firm, it could be a commercial organization, how do we make us together better at negotiating? And not just us as individuals. Those are questions that we have the answers in other fields, and how do we integrate all of this? Because my feeling is that for the moment, when you look at most of the faculty in most of the schools, negotiation is in a corner at the end of the corridor somewhere. What if we put it in the middle and kind of spread to all the other fields and try to change that mentality? Have I set a bar high enough, Jane?
Could we offer one bit of progress along that way? In our new book, the answer has gone from 0 to 1, but it's a big 1. There will be an analysis of Neil Rackham's decades of work training for salespeople who have to sell big, expensive stuff, and that's being adapted to negotiation more generally now.
And this kind of picks up on a point that David made in the last session where he was saying, context isn't just sort of the background, it is the negotiation. So in sales, it's not just technique, it's, how do you know about what people are wanting to buy in terms of widgets or whatever.
Well, when we talk about preparation, you do the same in law school. You have to prepare your negotiation, but you need to prepare your case. Know what the parties have done, the history and all of this. This thing we don't teach in the negotiation class because it's what they're being taught in other courses that they should use in their negotiations, right? But that matters. So creating links with this, I think, is very important at this point. Because when people, negotiate a new law about fiscal regulation at the European level, they need to know about fiscal regulation, about what happens in different countries and how to integrate all of this. This knowledge they're bringing in with them when they come into the negotiation class. How to handle a legal case successfully, how to handle a dispute successfully. This is learned through other classes. And then negotiation is giving them something else to integrate all of this. That's what I'm trying to do in my practice of teaching. And that's how you solve there's blood, there's numbers, and there are emotions in a negotiation because they're bringing it with them when they come into a negotiation.
So if we're thinking about sort of moving negotiation theory forward in terms of understanding what's really going on and thinking about how to prepare future lawyers as to what to do, what should we be doing as some of the best negotiation scholars that there are? Because we're really good at bringing really good people here. So what's the answer? Go ahead.
So I wanted to mention a couple things. One is that thinking about this clash between the old and the new, One of the most successful student papers that I've had recently actually looked at some of Noam's work about negotiating on the internet and using electronic devices and other,
Thingies is my term.
Thingies, yeah, all that electronic stuff, and combine that with some of the older negotiation theories, kind of getting the yes, classic, kind of distributive, integrative kind of style thinking, and all the different elements of that, and looked at a very specific negotiation, the negotiation between Steve Jobs and a publisher, where there are a lot of emails available about that very complicated negotiation. Went through looking at the emails and thinking about sort of the new technology piece of it and the kind of old human piece of it, both. And so I think we really need both, and I kind of tend to think we have to keep developing our theories and our ideas as we change, but also there's something really at the core of who we are as human beings and human psychology that does stay the same across time. And so that's the first thing I want to say. And then I want to turn to the second piece. And I want to say, I promised earlier that I was going to go back and I was going to say I did have a grand unifying theory, or I did want to, even though I don't really. But for a long time, I have been focusing on procedural justice and negotiation. And so I want to go back to your comment about Professor Riskin, who said it's all about respect. And I want to say I've been trying for a long time to think about whether we could have a grand unifying theory, but maybe like a little less grand, like a lowercase g grand theory of negotiation that was about procedural justice.
Can you define what procedural justice is?
So let me say that procedural justice is about the fairness that people receive in any kind of decision-making process. And so my work is on procedural justice in negotiation, and procedural justice is typically thought of as kind of 4 elements that form people's opinion about whether they've been treated fairly. And the first one is courtesy and respect. The next one is whether they had a voice. The next one is whether they trust the decision maker, which is a little hard in a dyadic negotiation. And the last one is even harder, it's neutrality. Is there kind of a neutral role decision rather than bias? And in my own empirical work, what I find is that when people are in a negotiation setting, the thing that's most important to them in making decisions about whether they've been treated fairly in the negotiation process is that courtesy and respect piece. That's the most important thing. And so then, kind of going back to this idea of a grand unifying theory, it's totally narcissistic. Of course, that's not really a grand unifying theory. It's what I do, so I'd like it to be as grand as possible. But I do think that when we think about what could help bring our field together, there are other ideas out there too that cut across a lot of these different pieces that are on that smorgasbord that I talked about before. And so when we think about procedural justice and the use of technology, for example, we could really learn a lot about thinking about why do people maybe feel that they do or that they don't have a voice when they're negotiating in a particular electronic kind of a negotiation setting. Or in procedural justice and the division between integrative and distributive bargaining, there's a lot there to think about. When people feel that the process is fair, they also actually feel that the process is more collaborative and is more integrative. And there's actually research that I've done that suggests that the more procedurally just the negotiation, actually the more integrative potential is realized in a negotiation. Or you could look at procedural justice and BATNA, from getting the yes, we heard a little bit about BATNA before, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. That's like some kind of thing that's going to happen if you don't actually get the negotiation settled in its context. What's going to happen outside? Sometimes people think of that as kind of a benchmark, a neutral kind of a benchmark. And so you could think about whether that neutrality piece relates to procedural justice and BATNA. I could go on because I have a lot of different areas where I think procedural justice plays a role. But I wonder if maybe instead of thinking about a grand unified theory that really answers everything, we could start to think about a few different broad theories that bring a lot of these areas together.
Now, just to be clear, and going back to the 9 o'clock session, which some of you may not have been here, I did not organize this to propose that we develop a grand unified theory, and we may or may not want to do that. I'm going to turn to Rishi to address whether that would be a good idea or not.
Yes, from a human understanding of the world perspective, it would be wonderful, right? If we could say, this is a negotiation. What if, however we define that, it's a negotiation within certain parameters. So all of these 4 or 5 criteria, or these 4 or 5 things must apply to this negotiation. And I don't know if we could get there exactly right, because part of what the problem problem is of course negotiation is about human beings, just as you were saying, right? It's about these sort of fundamental human relationships, starting from Hammurabi and the Bible and all this stuff. I don't know if we've changed that much over time. I mean, certainly, right, in the way we relate to gender and race and all these other things. Certainly we have a completely different conception of almost people in some sense, but I don't know how much that has changed from sort of our fundamental human relationship experience, right? It's almost, it's a little bit, right, like every negotiation, like a marriage, right, in some sense, every marriage is slightly different, and if you looked at every marriage in, you know, the US or in the world, I would have to think we would have to see some commonalities, right? Part of the problem is, of course, going back to what David was saying in the last session, we don't know enough, right? We haven't looked at enough negotiations. We haven't really drilled down on some of these things. That being said, you know, going and you know, you pointed out, of course, your work is, you know, is important, right? One of the things that I do about my work, right? You know, of course, I want there to be a grand unified theory. Why? Because, you know, I take, you know, what I think of as sort of broadly negotiation theory, and I try to apply it to, like, oh, what about elections, or what about plea bargaining, or what about this other random thing that we didn't necessarily think of as a negotiation per se, but can we still use these tools? And I want to say yes, right? I want to say that, yeah, there's still something about the way we conceptualize conflict, or the way we conceptualize BATNA, or the way we conceptualize some of these other negotiation tools that we've been teaching in these classes are going to apply, whether it's 13 days and, you know, the, you know, Israeli-Egypt negotiations, or whether it's, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis, or whether it is really just, you know, me and my brother fighting over where we want to go for dinner tonight, right? Like, I feel like there has to be, just because there's something about individualized conflict situations that has to be conceptualized in a way that humans can understand them. And because we think there is some sort of relationship between them, maybe that's enough to say from a psychological perspective, there is something about those things. And maybe that's where, in addition to what David was saying, we need more data, maybe we do need more psychology, or we need more, you know, we need other people to come into our field and say, yeah, this is something we know about humans more generally. How is that going to apply in the legal world? And not necessarily the legal negotiation world, but just maybe not the legal world, but the negotiation world more generally.
Let me posit for discussion that there will not be a single grand unified theory of negotiation. There may or may not be, but assuming that there isn't, maybe there are pieces that we can say are useful, that ought to be part of, you know, some piece of this mosaic or a smorgasbord or whatever kind of metaphor you want to use. So maybe it would be useful for us to think about what would be an important part of whatever theory we want to have. And Brooke, one of our newest faculty members, wants to jump in. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, to draw in what Noam was talking about earlier. Talk louder.
Please.
What Noam was talking about earlier with regards to the change in technology that has occurred and how that influences negotiation, I would have to think, insofar as negotiation is a conflict-solving mechanism, and information is a necessary part of that. You could think of negotiation as an exchange of information, sometimes a selective exchange of negotiation, to the extent that our technology has made information more universal, that it's much harder to keep important pieces of information from whoever you are negotiating with. They have access, by and large, to everything that you have, with some important exceptions. And to the extent that, you know, how important are those exceptions and what are they? I'd be interested in knowing more about that.
And I'll just say that that's one of the striking ways in which I feel that negotiation has fundamentally changed. That's the information. Another thing is that I think human relationships have, to some extent, fundamentally changed. I'm talking now about information is one element of negotiation in an elements world. Relationship is another. You were talking about, marriages are so and so, and I think that's a striking example of how we have this picture in mind about how pair bonding forms, and then, lo and behold, we're living in a world where 1/3 of marriages are between people who meet online. And that's just an example of how we're living differently. And I think that affects everything. And through its everything, I'm not arguing the point, I'm trying to say that this is not just not just in the sense of we need to fit technology in it. I'm trying to think we need to fit the people who we are now, whether we've changed or not, into that picture. And I think that we'd be wise to think about the people who are to come, not to get too messianic and but the people who are to come, like John, when you tried to say, I mean, there are people up there who are, typing on their laptops or looking at their, so there are people up there who the things that they're looking at on their phones now are things that none of us on this table know the names of those apps. We're not familiar with any of them. And they are now, very, very quickly, those apps that you're using are going to be very, very old-fashioned. They're going to be the MySpace of 2016. MySpace is already an archaeological kind of...
Some of them may not even know what MySpace is.
So how can both we project so that as theorists we're not conceptualizing things that happen, as teachers we're not teaching according to what is, to the world we lived in or the books that we read, but rather ahead. And in general we've had other conversations about this in other forums. How can we prepare negotiators for change in all of these things? In other words, the grand theory of negotiation, whenever it gets written, one element of it might be that change happens and negotiation changes, negotiators change, and that's something to take into account. Again, just trying to make things more confusing so that we...
I actually think you reminded me of something when you said that I hadn't really put together before, but all legal fields grow and adapt to change, right? And so I teach civil procedure. So, notice by publication in the newspaper used to be fine, and now my students have...
What's a
they don't
newspaper?
even see a newspaper. They understand the concept.
Well, there was a federal court case just a week ago. You were about to...
No, you go ahead. But I'm just saying, I mean, we know in all these other areas that we have to update our frameworks. I mean, we take the old framework and somehow figure out a way to apply it in a new setting. So, I hadn't thought of it in that same
And the legal field is the slowest of any that I know.
No offense.
No offense, some of my best friends are lawyers. Some of my best wives are lawyers. Officially, I am as well. But as a profession, the legal profession is the slowest one to adapt. Certainly to technological changes, and I'm also talking about a bunch of others. So the fact that as of last week, the federal court has allowed to send notifications, official court notifications, by Twitter, that's nice. And it's nice to know that, but it's 2016, and Twitter is very, very old. And how do we keep on top of that? There, close parentheses.
I mean, in some ways,
Yes.
part of what we're talking about is sort of whether there's a general theory of negotiation that transcends these changes, or whether these changes really affect what negotiation theory is or should be. And another question is really sort of what it is or should be, whether there are changes or not. Chris, I know you wanted to jump in.
Well, I would like to offer a modest bit of evidence in favor of the idea that there is a unified theory forming, okay? It's anything but grand, all right? The best term I can come up with for currently is messy, all right? Because it goes off in all sorts of different directions. But Andrea and I are in the middle of an exercise right now in the closing stages of putting together this big new book. And the exercise is linking one chapter to another. There's 100 chapters plus in this book. There are concepts that go off in every direction we could find and in every culture we could find. And we were up to 30 different professions and specialties in the last book, and we've lost count this time, okay? We are not finding it hard to find linkages. Every chapter turns out to link to at least a few others. And that exercise, I think, starts to make it apparent that there is an overall intellectual architecture to our field, and we expect to develop that further in future. Like I said, this is messy, because what you look for, I think, as an ideal in a unified theory of something is elegance. You look for the crystalline statement that allows you to sort of grasp it and walk around it. You want to walk around our book, metaphorically, you're in for a walk, all right? And therefore we know that we lack elegance in that sense, and probably we will lack it for decades. But I believe the journey is visible as having started.
I would love to believe in a unified field theory of negotiation. Let me argue with you, Chris, that I'm not sure that the evidence you're presenting would support your theory, that there is or will be. I think of a unified theory as something that is generally accepted. So if we had people, you know, in the room who said, okay, we understand that this is what negotiation theory is, and to some extent the closest bit of it, I think, is this integrative distributive thing where people generally understand or think they understand what that is. I mean, you could take a look at your book and you can see these linkages, but other than you and Andrea and, you know, those crazy few people who will read that all, it's, you know, no one would say, I don't think, that, you know, this is a general understanding of negotiation theory that, you know, everybody who thinks about negotiation or understands it would know. So, I mean, to me, I guess maybe one question is what we mean by unified theory, and more importantly for me is, I mean, I guess as much as I would love to think that there would be, I'm not expecting that. So I guess if we can't get that, what's the next best thing? And Sandra wants to jump in.
Yeah, so I'm wondering whether when we say unified theory, we're expecting to have something that works in all contexts, right? And then it can only be an intellectual exercise of looking from high above, looking at all these contexts that we represent and saying, oh look, they use Batman, they use Batman, they do this and they do this, right? The problem that I think we still have is that you can't take these observations, and it's absolutely true, and I'm going to add one precept pretty soon. But the problem that we have is that knowing just that does not help you be a better lawyer negotiating or a better planner negotiating, because all the rest is context. So how you instantiate all these precepts that are just totally general, I think that we're there already in some respect. The way that they get embodied in every context is very different. So the precept, it's going to be a gift from me to you, is whenever you walk into a negotiation, please assume that everybody's at least as intelligent as you, if not more. Okay? And it's sort of like the companion observation to respect, or the same or something, but just, this is general for all the contexts in which we operate, and in each and every one same.
You're looking for clarity.
Yes.
And a rule. That is characteristic, I would say, of a lawyer's training and a lawyer's professional orientation. But we're dealing with a lot of people who are not lawyers and who come from very different professional and cultural backgrounds. And I would think that if we are forming the early stages, or some of the early stages with other people working for other directions, no doubt, but if we are engaged in forming the beginnings of some unified theory, there's clearly a large chunk of that theory that is about A, difference, and B, context sensitivity. And in fact, there are whole chunks of chapters in the book which talk about that. So a part of this is variance.
Oh, go ahead, Lisa, go ahead.
So, Professor Lady, you mentioned that you would love to have a unified theory. Why?
Because
what does that bring that we don't already have?
well, in some ways, what that does is it gets to the, you know, the premise of this symposium, which is, you know, it's from the Tower of Babel to a world of greater mutual understanding, so that it would mean that we could communicate with each other and we would have some better ways of, we would understand each other better, as opposed to having people talk 100 different languages where we don't understand each other. So, you know, you were talking about how you negotiate and you come into it with your mindset, but unlike what Sandra said, not everybody has read the book, not everybody is prepared, not everybody is as smart as you are. So to some extent, it would be having a common language, or a more common language. So to me, that is the value, and a more common set of factors that they're going to focus on. So and I say this, that would be my ideal, but I'm not holding my breath because I'd like to survive. Did you want to follow up, Lisa, or in terms of what the underlying, the you know, and thought underlying your question?
So if you then, assuming that you reached this unified theory and that everyone agreed that that is the unified theory, you're always going to have outliers, I would say. So again, so my question is, so even if you could get 75% of the people to agree with this unified theory and know about it, right? Because the other part is having everybody not just agree to it, but also be aware of it, you're still going to have outliers. So how do you, again, how do you force people into a procedural method? Or if that's the case, then does it really matter that it's a unified theory that's agreed upon by most, but not all?
Well, I mean, you're never going to get perfection. You're never going to get 100%. I mean, the value might be, you know, greater understanding. And so in some ways, it's like saying, well, you know, there are differences in understanding of what civil procedure is, although there's probably a much greater sense of consensus. But if there weren't, we'd have one heck of a time with, you know, filing documents in court and how people would deal with that. So, I mean, in some ways, that's a useful contrast of saying the fact that there are some generally understood and accepted things means that life works a lot more smoothly than having to, you know, invent things on the fly and have me say, well, you know, this is a good complaint, and Noam's the judge and says, well, I'm sorry, but, you know, counsel, that isn't a good complaint, and I'm not going to accept it. So part of it is having, you know, greater understanding. I need to end here because our time is up, and I want to end with an apology. You know, we started off, for those of you who are in the 9 o'clock session, pointing out that I'm a failure at retirement. And I promised at the beginning of this session that we would solve all the problems of negotiation theory, and unfortunately we have failed. Hopefully you have enjoyed it nonetheless and found this a useful experience. I want to ask you to thank me, or join me in thanking the panel.